but I appreciate you being with us tonight. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claudio. I'm the PSEP project director, and I'm just going to go over a few protocols that we like to share with the public before the meetings. We'll just ask everyone to please keep your sound off unless you're talking. There is a participant box at the bottom, and also turn off your camera if you don't feel comfortable being on the live stream, because this meeting is also being recorded and live streamed on the PSEP YouTube channel. And we do look out for Zoom bombing. So if someone is being interrupting the meeting, I will remove them from the meeting. And we just ask that everyone hold any questions you may have for the time when public comment is holding for the meeting. And yeah, those are a few protocols. If you guys have any questions, feel free to just send me a message on the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claudia, for sharing that. And welcome everyone to the final webinar for the Truth and Reconciliation. And it's final webinar, but not final part of the series. We'll be having one more next Wednesday. Final event workshop. We'll have the opportunity to go more into depth on the Portland perspective. But today, we have a really awesome opportunity to hear from Professor Antti Pentikainen and some of his colleagues, as well as Marcia Perez, a fellow PSEP member. And we will be focusing tonight's webinar on trauma-informed responses in talking about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And Antti probably will give a much better description than I will of that. But I also just wanted to provide a little bit of background for folks who are not familiar with PSEP. PSEP is out of the settlement agreement the city underwent with the DOJ for excessive use of force with instances of folks who are perceived to or actually experiencing mental health crises. PSEP has been around since 2018. I'm one of the co-chairs along with Elliot Young. And this project, this webinar series really came out of a lot of really hard work from PSEP on recommendations that we worked on, and with the support from the mayor directing us to develop a planning ad hoc committee, which brought us to where we are today. And so I'm really excited to be wrapping the webinar part of the series and getting into the workshop next week. And this will be an amazing webinar. I'm very excited to have Antti and the rest of his team here. And I also wanted to share a little bit about more on the TRC. Well, no, I pretty much shared all that. So I'll just now maybe hand it over to Anne to introduce Antti. I feel like folks have heard the spiel. So Anne.
Thank you, Taji. And thank you again, everyone, for being with us tonight. I also wanted to mention that this webinar series is a collaboration between PSU and the Oregon Humanities, as well as many others. And PSEP has been so lucky to be helped by such wonderful people. And tonight, I want to introduce, also, I am Ann Campbell. I'm on PSEP. I'm on the PSEP Steering Committee. And Taji and I and Lakiana have really been lucky to be on this TRC subcommittee. So tonight, I want to introduce Antti Pentikainen, who has been advising PSEP in planning this webinar series and preparing for a possible Truth and Reconciliation Commission Professor Petikanen has been involved with reconciliation processes since South Africa in 1995, where he worked after the new constitution's ending apartheid was approved. Since that, he has been leading, advising, and funding truth and reconciliation processes and commissions for over 2 decades. He served as special envoy for the Prime Minister of Finland, launching Truth and Reconciliation Commission with Sami indigenous people. Here in the United States, he has served as secretary for the US TRHT Leadership Group, advancing establishment of national commission based on resolution introduced by Representative Barbara Lee this year. Antti will introduce our other guests. Currently, Petikanen leads Mary Hoke Center for Reconciliation and is a reconciliation expert at the U.S. Institute of Peace.
Thank you, Anne, for always these generous introductions, and Tachi, and you guys are leading PSEP work on this field really beautifully, and I just want to congratulate you, as I do want to congratulate Mayor Wheeler for launching this effort. It is a beautiful moment when truth becomes possible, and that's also why I want to congratulate Portland people, because truth has the potential of healing. And I think the purpose of today's webinar is to seek to understand better how does truth and healing and justice connect to each other, and what other ideas we could have to provide you once you're planning to move forward. My kind of first line for the leadership of the city is that that when you make a process survivor-centered, they will advise you moving forward. That would be my key advice for going forward, and I think that has so much beautiful essence in it, because this means that the ethical grounding will be in the realities of Portland. And second, which I think will come in Dr. Corey Henderson's speech, is that the resources already exist that you need to move this process forward, including understanding what healing means and how to take it forward. So when it's survivor-centered, the wisdom will come from them, and they will have the knowledge and clarity to move this forward. But before inviting my two first colleagues that I will have a conversation with in the beginning, I want to say 3 theses to help you kind of picture the significance of healing. And one comes from a conversation I had with Eduardo Gonzalez that you've had the fortunate opportunity to listen to a couple of times already. So we were discussing about the connection of healing and justice. And Eduardo gave the statement, which has been really staying with me, is that there has been a blind spot in transitional justice where Truth and Reconciliation Commissions come from, to think that once the victims' rights have been achieved and the perpetrators have been receiving what they need, justice, and healing somehow happens. And he said this is a blind spot. This is not most often the case. So that's why we have to really carefully look into what does healing mean and how it should be supported. A second quote comes from a colleague from Beyond Conflict, Mike Nikonchuk, who is not with us here today, but he said an interesting quote saying that an healed person seeks different kinds of justice. Because often we view justice as a punitive side, but when it comes to healing, there is an invitation for that entity who has harmed you to become to a different kind of shared humanity with you. And I think there is a lot of wisdom in this, and I'm sure Colette and Corey will be discussing this on their presentation. But third is, and this is for you as a PSEP, is that eventually these processes are about living people and how these processes affect their daily lives. And once we have that in mind, and once you have that in mind when you're planning forward, you'll be able to design a process that's meaningful and impactful. The first person I'm really thrilled to bring into this conversation, and other PSEP member, is Marcia Perez, and I'd like you, Marcia, just to unmute so they can pin us to have this conversation in the beginning. But Marcia, you have really lived through what we're speaking about today. There was a family tragedy, and then you became a member of a PSEP. I just would love to hear from you the story, why this happened, and more about this journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this group this evening. My name is Marcia Perez, and I am a PSEP member. You are correct. So in 2016, I lost a family member. He was shot and killed by police. He was my nephew. He was my same age, and I will tell you that it was the most traumatic experience that I've ever experienced. I've spent the last decade of my life really dedicated to advocating for individuals in the criminal justice system and for those who, frankly, their lives don't feel like they matter. And there was nothing about that experience that was led with truth or acknowledgement. When my nephew was shot by police, I was immediately met with just interrogation, with lies, without truth, without any information, and understood that and was led to believe that he had killed himself. I found out from an Oregon Live article sitting in the emergency room while a detective was coercively trying to get my parents to sign over a search warrant that this most likely was my nephew sitting on the side of the road. He had never exited his vehicle. This was really challenging for me because I worked in law enforcement. I've worked with law enforcement. I understand how the system works, and I knew all the things that were going wrong. There was not transparency. There was no trust that I felt, and there was no empathy, frankly. And so I made it I too believe that, activism is a form of healing. And so I chose to join PSEP because I wanted to share my story. And I feel like there's strength in storytelling and the stories that we were able to share. And from the experience I had in the death of my nephew, I was belittled. I, again, was lied to. And it was actually, it was just astonishing that was happening, because I knew it was important, just based on my role in the community. I did successfully hire, thankfully, because of the resources that I have in the community and the collaborative work that I've done, was able to hire somebody and successfully completed a wrongful death suit where 3 law enforcement agencies were sued for violating my nephew's American Disabilities Act rights, as he had PTSD. And it was extremely important for my healing to be able to feel like there was justice and that there was some level of accountability. Now that was not sufficient, but it was a small win that I knew that I could hold on to. And so I do this work with PSEP so that I could elevate the voices of those. And I just want to mention the work that I did with Miss Kendra James's mother, who her daughter was killed by Portland police many years ago. And those are the opportunities I've had to be able to serve in this community. But it's a painful experience, and it's a demoralizing experience because your family members are not treated as victims. They are treated as suspects, and their families are treated as suspects. And there are no rights, and there are no advocates, and there are no peaceful phone calls saying, I'm sorry for your loss. And so that experience undoubtedly transformed the way I show up in my work, and how I show up in spaces and how I share my story.
Marcia, thank you for also sharing this today. And I just want to acknowledge the incredible courage and leadership and wisdom you have in this space. So thank you for coming today and share also the pain, incredible pain in the story and your personal journey in seeking truth, finding justice, and then also moving into advancing these causes. I thought to ask a general question, but if you may, if I put it on also on a personal level, what would for you what would mean to you to have a truth commission important, and when would you view it to become a success based on what you have experienced and seen?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges in Portland is that we have such an ugly history here, rooted in racism, which frankly just hasn't really been able to be acknowledged. And I think that the connection I make in my own experience in the context here in Portland is that the police bureau has had a very difficult time simply acknowledging, one, that racism exists in the culture and of the bureau in which they're affiliated, and that disparities exist in policing, that there's racial profiling, and without this simple acknowledgement of the issue, I don't know where, how we can get there. Now, if we had a truth and reconciliation, we would really need to get to just the fundamental acknowledgement, to address the harm in a restorative way that meets both individual and community unique needs. I mean, officers are impacted, and community is impacted, individuals, and we have to do this work together.
Thank you, Marcia, and also for the work you do in the schools in advancing healing. It's incredible. Thank you also for that. The next guest I'd like to invite to come in the conversation is another Marcia. Her name is Marcia Thompson, and she is a civil rights lawyer, and one of those people often sent to a situation of police brutality in high-profile cases like Rihanna Taylor, but so many others. And currently, she's living in Chicago and also involved in the truth, racial healing, and transformation efforts there. Marcia, thank you for joining us. I would just like to start asking you, when you are being sent into the situations of police brutality, how does trauma appear in those situations?
Thanks, Auntie, and thanks, PSEP, for inviting me. And it's always interesting to have another Marcia on the call. So thank you, Marcia, for being here today as well. And I'd like to actually, kind of pick up from where she left off, because I started my journey in this work. As Auntie said, I'm often called in as a peace builder, community builder, after a very high-profile incident of police brutality or alleged misconduct. Last one, as Auntie mentioned, was Rihanna Taylor. We did the after action report, my firm and some other attorneys and some other experts in the area. But I've been doing this work since 2001. So when Marcia, mentions her family's tragedy, unfortunately for me, I've seen many families over the last 20 years that I've gone in after something and had to hold the hand of a parent who has lost someone, but also try to build communities of trust after an incident like that. So it's a very difficult, vicarious scenario for me to feel that trauma from the folks that I'm there to try to help, but also try to bridge that gap between the community and the police. So as I mentioned, my journey started a long time ago, but I also worked with abused and neglected children, and that's how I got into this trauma-informed work. I was a prosecutor as a young lawyer, and I got trained in, how to interview children who had been abused and the way they would respond during trauma, and how to talk to them and how to communicate to them, and how sometimes their stories may change because of the way they view the world after that trauma. And so that type of foundation, and then becoming more involved in civil rights and police reform, I brought that trauma-informed approach with me. And so when I show up, oftentimes, again, Marcia is very astute in her lived experience by saying that there's trauma with the families, but then there's also trauma in the community because of the incident. And then there's also trauma on the side of the police that have to go into the communities that are enraged because of what happened. And so when I come in, I'm getting all that trauma from the individual families, from the police officers' perspective, because they feel like everyone hates them, even if they felt like it was one person who made a mistake. The community's enraged, and we've seen that nationally. In the last year, we've seen how incidents can have a ripple effect across our entire world, let alone a community. So that's what brings me to the table, Auntie. It's been, a lifetime of understanding trauma impacts us all differently. But when I come into a community, I now have to look at that kind of that trifecta. I can't just look at the family that's impacted. I have to look at the community impact. And then I also have to deal with the officers' trauma as well, and try to find where is the common ground. And through 20 years of doing this, I've seen that there is common ground there, and being a peace builder, and my history and 20 some years of working in peace building as well. I always try to find the common ground, because if we don't find common ground, we can't have a conversation. And if we can't find something to talk about that we agree on, we'll never get to that point of healing on either perspectives. And so I think that's the piece that I've always looked for. And I've seen lately that trauma is that common ground. Some of the cities that I've gone into, we've had separate conversations. So I'll have a conversation with the community and they'll be grieving. There'll be tears. There'll be lots of grief over many victims within the communities at the hands of police, and just violence in general. When, communities have violence that's not perpetrated just by the police, but just violence and the systemic issues that Marcia mentioned as well that cause our communities to have disparities in the justice system. Being an attorney, I've seen that. And so just all of that kind of coming together causes trauma for communities. And then you go talk to the officers in a separate conversation, and they say the same thing about feeling traumatized. I know when I went into Ferguson after they had already been under consent decree, and I went in just to listen to the community to see if they had recovered from some of the things that had happened. And they talked about trauma. And then about 2 hours later, I talked to some of the police officers. And I realized they said the exact same thing, that 80% of the police department quit after that incident. I didn't know that. And so 80%, now 80% of the police department wasn't involved in the racial issues that DOJ wrote up. If anybody's read that report, DOJ doesn't often put the word race in their reports as a word to say someone is racist. They'll say there's race disparities, there's racial injustice. But in that report, they said there's racism. And so that whole community suffered. And so when I talked to the police separate, they also said there was trauma because 80% of their police officers left the community. So they had to bring in new people to also be integrated into a community that was traumatized. So when I kept hearing that word, I realized that they may have come there from two different places, but that was one common theme that I left that place with, was that everybody felt traumatized. And they even may have been the person who traumatized each other, but then also they may not have recognized that they were triggering one another. And so that conversation, I think, can happen. And I really, again, applaud my colleague Marcia to say that we have to heal first. We have to recognize what's caused each perspective to be different, and for this chasm that has been caused in communities between police and citizens. And then once that's recognized and some of that healing starts, then I think they can come together and talk about trauma and how to recover as a community. And there's lots of research on how trauma impacts communities, but there's also a lot of research now on how trauma is impacting police and their responses to community and how it's causing them to not respond appropriately. And so some of these cases that have been brought on, that's why I say this approach should really be talked about, because stress impacts all of us differently. And we know that from children to adults to professions. And so if we don't see that common theme and address it, it's going to continue to perpetuate in different ways and be negatively impacting our communities and the communities that the police are supposed to be serving.
Thank you, Marcia. And I just want to say how fortunate the families have been to have you to come there, and for you to have had the courage and strength and resilience to stay in this work for 2 decades, like you said. It's incredible. But also I want to say to you how fortunate this country is to have people like you who have been on this work and can advise and moving forward other local processes, but also a national process. So thank you for all of that. I'd love to ask you a second question also before we move forward, and it may relate to kind of also why you are still in this work. So a little bit moving out of the trauma to the connection of justice and healing. Based on everything you've seen, can you a little bit speak about through those experiences about the connection of justice and healing?
Well, I think that Ferguson example is really the true, testament to justice and healing, because after a couple of years of already being there trying to make reforms, the community is still saying that they're trying to heal from what happened. And if they can't heal from what happened, they can't feel like they can move towards that reconciliation aspect or that transformation. So that's why, if you notice, for those of you who are in police reform, you'll notice that these many cities are under consent decrees. It's a long time. They don't go in, they don't reform because they're not trying. It's just a lot that has caused them to get to this point. And so the justice system itself needs to be healed in some of these communities. And so it's not just the police, it's not just our communities, it's the entire system. And again, in Ferguson's scenario, I think that is so indicative of a true scenario that every layer of justice was impacted by systems of inequality. And so until they fixed each layer of that, they can't start to heal that community, and that consent decree will continue. And the community will still try, but there still may be barriers. And so again, I think the common word would be equity. Once we start getting equity across our justice systems, that could be racial equity, social equity, all the different types of equity we've all seen in the last year that have come out of not just policing, but COVID and everything else. There is a common thread of equity. And I think if equity can be seen as part of reform, and not just in the policing, but across our social justice networks and systems, then I think that will help our justice systems heal and help our communities heal. And then maybe there can be some transformation between the police and the communities as well, and start moving that conversation forward. But I think there's a lot of other systems that need to be reconciled, and equity needs to be interwoven in those systems before we can get to the point of true reform.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for both of you, Marcia Perez, for speaking the truth and your story, and Marcia, you speaking in great detail about the process. You gave so much insights and really important wisdom for Portland and PSIP when you're considering the next steps. And if you have a chance to stay in the call for the next hour, we would love to have your comments during the Q&A. But if you need to go, thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us. So I'll just say a couple of words before I hand it over to Colette, and actually use some slides. They'll be quick, so don't turn off your cameras. But I want to show you a learning of what we have from international experiences, why transformation is important. I want you to forget the term reconciliation. I know that contested, especially in the United States, where a lot of the indigenous communities and African Americans say that there wasn't ever a good state of affair where we could go back to. But I want to focus on these international experiences and start with the Northern Ireland, which is a case example of having a minimalist process, which aims to end the violence and establish certain rule of law and a new political system, but it's also very agnostic. The pain of the Northern Ireland process is that once the violence ended on the streets, it moved into private spaces. So the number of domestic violence, suicides, and sexual violence increased and still continued to increase. And I believe this is the result of not addressing the trauma, that people, when they remain traumatized, even when the streets become safe, that trauma moves into private spaces and affects many generations. The second point is South Africa, where the narrative change regarding apartheid happened, and they had rights established, they had new institutional reform and a justice accountability system, but it didn't lead into equity that Marcia Thompson was so eloquently speaking about, nor renewed relationships. And therefore, I think we're looking today in a situation of deepening polarization, even risk of renewed violence in South Africa. So what these two cases speak to us is that there has to be an element ambition to aim for transformation. And I think when you are launching a process, my recommendation for Portland is to design a process that moves all the way to that end of the spectrum, where relationships are being transformed, where individuals can find some healing and the societal transformation can happen. The second slide I want to speak about is the connection of individual trauma into group dynamics and the society. So an individual who doesn't want to address their trauma, we know from science today that it becomes actually part of your DNA. It becomes wired in your brain. And I'm sure Colette Rauch will speak about this, but you will see it in your life in diseases. You will be sicker. You will not be doing well as an individual. And unless you have that perspective of healing, it'll be really hard for you to heal those societal relationships that need also healing. So the key argument I have is that trauma awareness is key for personal healing, but only through personal healing you can actually make a significant effort to heal the social relationships. And when you look to a society that is not through healing aiming for equity and justice, easily becomes a zero-sum game, continuation of zero-sum game, or a security approach rather than a new society. So I think the challenge for the society at the process is to see the pattern from individual to social healing and societal transformation. And I just wanted to start with these teasers before I hand it over to my colleague, Colette Rauch, who is also a research professor at the Mary Hogue Center for Reconciliation. Colette used to be Vice President for Innovation at the U.S. Institute for Peace, but she was also launching their work in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kosovo. But before that, she was a federal prosecutor in the state of California. So she has a wealth of knowledge in this field, but has been recently focusing on neuroscience, trauma, and peace building. And after Colette, our dear colleague and friend Corey Henderson, Dr. Corey Henderson, will be speaking, and he's a historical trauma and expert from Baltimore, where through his practical work within communities, he'll be advising us how our histories affect who we are and how that has to be taken into account in the processes that we're leading. Over to you, Colette.
Thank you, Antti. Before I start, I just wanted to give a little bit of a perspective as to how I'm coming at this topic. As Antti mentioned, I had worked in our own criminal justice system for about 10 years on both the side as a prosecutor at the state and federal level, and then as a public defender representing death row inmates. And that work was really a pivot point for me in understanding the human dimension of the criminal justice system, and especially with working with death row inmates on their appeals and really looking at it from what got them to the stage where they were in their life and the history. And I think that really left a mark on how I saw the world and all the different opportunities that were missed through their childhood and through the justice system that perhaps could have changed the outcome of where they ended up when I met them as their lawyer. And then after that, the past 20 years working in, Antti said, a number of different countries coming out of violent conflict, where I worked on justice sector and security sector reform and human rights. And a lot of my work over the past 8-9 years revolved around community and police dialogue and working together after conflict, a lot of trauma, a lot of interpersonal, societal conflict, systemic injustices. As Marcia Thompson talked about, equity was missing, and it was driving so many different things that were driving the conflict, and finding out a way that they could come together through these circumstances and have a vision for a way to transform their systems in a different way in the future that would be more equitable and more just. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do some slides here. And I wanted to kind of do a framework of putting trauma, a lot of the things that Marcia Perez talked about, Marcia Thompson talked about, Antti talked about, and my dear colleague Corey will talk about further, and put this in a system. So I want to start out just with the trauma ecosystem. And as we know, and others talked about, really it runs throughout our system individually, the way we grew up, epigenetics, the genetic makeup, our experiences, all these things make who we are. And trauma, naturally, as long as we're human, trauma is going to come into play. It plays out in families and neighborhoods in that microsystem, and then certainly around other issues of class and race and belief of whose value is greater than others. all of these things play out. And then naturally, it's coming into our systems, the institutions, from the educational system all the way through our justice systems and social media. So all of these systems, as a systems approach, trauma comes into play, and it is interacting within those systems. And we know that it impacts us institutionally. And as Marcia Thompson talked about, it's also collectively, community, institutionally. And Corey will talk more about historical trauma. We know now through a lot of studies on public health, studies on neuroscience, we look at the prenatal and early childhood experiences and how critical those early years are for our wiring in our nervous systems, whether we could be more susceptible than others because of certain experiences in childhood or even in pregnancy. We can be more susceptible to trauma. We know that institutions, how people are treated, toxic leadership, we know that these things can come into bear and can play into our systems, and how trauma can be embedded through those life experiences, absolutely come into play. So we're weaving the tapestry of our life from prenatal all the way through. And our nervous system and our brain is gathering experience on how to be in the world. And it is learning how to be in the world based upon those experiences, interplaying with our genetic makeup to form who we are. And we also, I think Marcia mentioned even the aspect of vicarious and secondary trauma. Working with police, when I was in the justice sector overseas, those who work with individuals who are exposed to violence, even if it has not been perpetrated against them, pick up trauma through vicarious and secondary means. And we know that when trauma is unresolved, not only, as Auntie said, there are physical manifestations, illness, we know that. We also know behavioral, emotional aspects come to play, but we also know things like difficulty envisioning a future. When I worked with individuals coming out of war to think about a future, a strategic plan for a more just security sector and justice sector, it was difficult for them to do that. It's because when you are under threat, you're not worrying about the future, you're worrying about surviving right now. So it's very difficult to be thinking about envisioning and planning and collaborating for a future. The past is still in the present, and until that is processed and resolved, it's difficult to move forward. We also know that there's challenges in collaboration. As Marcia Thompson said, you trigger each other and you get these cycles of conflict, cycles of even violence in certain circumstances. It's difficult to cooperate when you're feeling under threat and when your trauma is unresolved. We know we have reactive relationships, and we know that those can be hardwired into a pattern where somebody says something, we react. I remember in Northern Ireland, speaking with police officers who were Catholic going into Protestant communities, and they learned to say nothing during the Orange March, because as one said to me, I say something, they say something, I say something again, next thing you know, there's blows and then somebody gets killed. So we know that reactive relationships get furthered by unresolved trauma. Difficulty concentrating is a very big one. When we are under threat or when trauma is not resolved, we know that the part of our brain that needs to problem solve, be creative, that is not fully online because we are in survival mode. Then a very important thing when it comes to reform or change, especially systemic change, there's resistance to that. It may seem strange, but when we feel that our survival, our privilege, our role in society, our identity, if we feel it's a threat in a nervous system standpoint, we resist that. And in some ways, it's looked at as a threat to survival. So these are things that come up with unresolved trauma or unprocessed discussion around trauma. So how do we look at this when we're looking at societal transformation? When we look at truth processes as a vehicle to heal, as well as to come up with ways to move forward as a society for accountability and as a vehicle for equity. There's certain things that we know that individual and collective trauma, we know that it can drive division and harm and keep those going. And as we talked about, it's linked to adverse physical, mental, and spiritual health outcomes. And we know it can be destructive conflict. Constructive conflict is a positive thing, but destructive conflict is one that tears at the societal fabric and puts us in cycles of community violence. But we do know that healing, as Auntie talked about, can be the gas to heal divisions and transform society. And it is very central to reconciliation. And again, as Auntie said, reconciliation has different definitions. But if we look at it as a way mainly of building trust, of building a community where people feel safe and valued with dignity and equity, if we look towards that as societal transformation, then transforming trauma can provide the foundation for that to be more supported. So one thing, and Marcia Thompson talked about this very eloquently, trauma is always in the room. So when we are in dialogue, when we are in truth process discussions, when we are in any situation where aspects of harm, abuse, anything comes up, we know it's going to impact the success of the process. We know that, whether it's conflict resolution or other processes, because we all are human. We bring into the room, we bring into the dialogue, we bring into community with what we still carry and the trauma residue or active trauma that's still there. And so it is so deeply important that not only as individuals, whether we're engaged in discussion, facilitating, supporting, whether we have been victims or family of victims, whatever role we take, or multiple roles oftentimes in these processes, it's important that we look at how healing and trauma healing our wounds can be done in a way that is effective and authentic to us, and that when we are helping support these processes, that the processes themselves are informed and educated, and a sensitive approach is taken into the design and implementation. So it's the individual, but it's also the process itself needs to integrate a more trauma-informed approach so that we're not doing more harm, and that the process itself can maybe even be an avenue for healing. This is just one. There are many different trauma-informed approaches. There's police trauma-informed, social worker trauma-informed, educational-informed, lawyers, as Marcia Thompson talked about. This is just one example that the CDC set forth that I find very helpful in that it starts with safety. If we are not safe in a dialogue, if we are not safe when we're discussing these things, then it's very difficult for us to be able to have a trauma-informed or a trauma healing process. And then there's other aspects. Sometimes in these processes, there's peer support, there's empowerment, voice, choice. All of these types of things that are listed here are things that can be woven into, and a process can figure out how it best works for them. These are things that are principles, but it's very important for individuals and communities to have agency and be feel empowered to make choices for themselves on what is most helpful. There is definitely no one size fits all. So in summary, looking at this for processes, it's important to have awareness and education around it, for us to realize when we're being triggered and where we can see and support others in that we're taking care of our own health. We're supporting others, that, and I think Corey will talk about, he's an expert on participatory research, that we don't come in and impose, but we co-create an approach that is appropriate for a specific circumstance. And we're very careful that whatever we're doing, we look with an eye that there's a do no harm principle. And one thing that I want to mention with this is oftentimes truth telling can be telling of stories and narratives. In some circumstances, that can be very healing, and others, it can be actually re-traumatizing. And so it's very important that people be able to make choices where they tell their story, who they tell it to, and how they tell it. And that's a very important aspect. The last thing I want to say is just two quick examples. Last summer and in the fall, I was working with some of the activists that were in Seattle and Portland and Detroit, and some of the street medics that were engaged with supporting some of the protesters and working with them on a couple of incidences that had happened. And when they were first in the beginning, when it first happened with them, it was so apparent that there was a freeze type of mode and there was a trauma response, which was very natural. So timing is everything in these processes. At that moment, the most important thing was to support, and then that was it. It was not the time to be having dialogue or discussion. First of all, the prefrontal cortex and other things were not really online to be able to do that. The body, the nervous system, and the brain was in survival mode and in a state of acute stress. So when I talk about timing, it's very important in these processes to meet the person and the process where they are, to know that emotions are going to come out, that there's certain things physiologically that are possible at sometimes rather than others. And the last case study is a dialogue with police and community members in Nepal following a series of protests where protesters have been killed. And I was working first with police and then working with the community. And it took a lot of time before we brought them together. So a lot of these things have to be the truth-telling processes at a cadence that works with the individuals and a cadence that takes honor of where they are, where their nervous systems are, and what's possible. And over time, they were able to then get to the root of some of the issues. But for the first, goodness, it was at least a year, we were just working on dealing with the trauma, working at small steps of dialogue, building relationships, even just an agreement to meet. And so sometimes we want change to happen quickly because of the harm being done, but sometimes we need to work and honor where the nervous system and the process allows. So with that, it is my honor to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Corey Henderson. He holds a PhD in public health, and his research is rooted in social and behavioral sciences with an emphasis on historical trauma's influence on the health of African Americans. And through his research on the policies and practices that reinforce systemic racism, he's developed several models that help shine the light on the roots of systemic issues. So Corey, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Colette, and thank you, Auntie. I'm going to jump straight into this because I want to make sure we get to questions tonight. I'm going to take a different approach. My approach is going to build off of what you heard, and I'm going to take you on a trail of stories. So we're going to go general, then we're going to go specific, and then we're going to go even more specific. I'm going to tell you a little story. So let me share my screen first. This is the general approach, and the general is going to start with this image here, this picture here. And what it really shows you is that there's a long trail of trauma in the life of African Americans. And if I just scroll down, because I want to talk to some of this, you'll see I'm still in the 1800s. I'm not even at the 1900s yet. And here I am at the Black church displacement in the early 1900s, racial zoning, restrictive covenants. We celebrated 1919, 100 years where over 30 cities were vandalized. If you ever drive on 95 north or south, you're usually driving through Black communities that were split in half by the highway. The highway administration that started in the early 1918, 1920 time period built specifically to divide and break up whole communities of wealth, of races of people that they didn't want to have wealth, to compete against them. So let me take you back to the front real quick because I want to use my 15 minutes wisely. What about when you're traveling to a country that you've been snatched and brought to against your own will? And on the way there, somebody says, oh man, we forgot water. We ran out of water and 2 of the slaves have died. In the process of getting to the place, they decided that, hey, we don't have enough water and food to feed the slaves. So let's just throw them overboard. So they decided in the Zong massacre of 1781 to throw overboard 132 African slaves, and many of them, most of them, were still alive. There were no charges brought. When they find themselves in the Caribbean, they pull up on land, and the insurance company says, we're not paying you for the bodies that you insured. And they take them to court. And they say, wait up, we paid for insurance. We want insurance money. And the judge then says, what is this claim the human people have been thrown overboard. This is a case of chattels or goods. Blacks are goods and property. It is madness to accuse these well-serving, honorable men of murder. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard. That, add to it, maybe what, 300 years? People are still feeling the pain of being told they have no value. 1619, 1609, 1669, by the time we come to Virginia, we're now looking at the Casual Killing Act. What happens is white women are beating the slave children, trying to get them to act right. We all have had children, many of us, that they don't listen. Children have a mind of their own. And that's because they're trying to learn the world. So these women are trying to correct these slave children because the parents are in line. They've been beat, they've succumbed to the pain, and they now listen, but the children won't. So the women beat these children to the point of death. They passed a law called the Casual Killing Act in Virginia that says it is legal to kill a slave while correcting them, and malice could not be presumed because they are your property. This is the same thing that we see when police officers kill in many communities. There are no charges. Don't worry about it. They were just acting out. You got to prove that these were bad people. So we hear they smoke weed. Oh, we found a blunt. Oh, we found a marijuana joint. Something to say that these people deserve to be killed. So we look back 300-400 years and we still see the impacts of what happened hundreds of years ago. That's historical trauma. When a woman holds the hand of a child in a bank and won't let her Black child run around and jump around, it's the trauma of somewhere along the line, I need to protect my children because they may never, ever come home again. It's the idea that if I let you go out and do all types of crimes, I will never report you. I will never do anything to harm you, to never come home again, because the pain of me losing you is more painful than you being alive and not being in my home. So no, don't go get your education. Don't graduate. Just come home every day. Just come home. No matter what you do, just come home. Because the idea of a man walking by my daughter and saying, oh, she's looking real nice today, the impact is, I think subconsciously, to the idea that he might see my daughter growing up, snatch her, rape her. That's post-traumatic slave syndrome. The idea that you say to your son, oh, you're big and strong, you're growing up, you can do great works. And somebody walk up and say, oh man, your son is big and strong. And the first thing you say is, no, sir. No, he's just a knucklehead. We put each other down because it's the protective mechanism that you will snatch my son and sell him to a different plantation. That's post-traumatic slave syndrome. So very quickly, before I close on this story, my research, the reverberating influence of historical trauma on the health of African Americans, looks at bucketing the policies of a community under segregation, serial forced displacement, physical psychological abuse, economic destruction, and cultural loss. When you can identify in your own community those policies that led to people having deleterious effects on their livelihood, their ability to move about, their ability to advance themselves economically, or their ability to establish their own communities. In Baltimore specifically, when we had the Great Fire of 1904, Blacks lived downtown. If you ever been to Baltimore, we have a beautiful harbor. Well, Blacks lived at the bottom of the harbor. All the water ran towards the bottom. The city council didn't want to put in water lines because most of them owned the cleaning companies that clean the streets. So all the dirt got pushed, all the mud got pushed, and they decided to revamp downtown. When the fire happened, they built the city on top of the fire burned city and moved the Blacks to West Baltimore. If you ever look at a map of Baltimore City from Martin Luther King Boulevard all the way to West Baltimore, Owings Mills, Carroll County, you can follow the policies. The Black Lung Block, where the police wouldn't go into the community. All of the things that happened have impacted and began right when Blacks were forced to live in a specific community. And right from that point, after the 1800s, 1890s, Blacks once lived in communities with whites. But when they established these policies, they decided, Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, was part of the city council that said the 50-50 rule. If 50% of one side of the street is Black, you can't live there, white person. So you need to live on the other side of the street. And if 51% of the other side of the street is white, a Black person cannot live on that side of the street. So literally in Baltimore City, we had a street by the name of Hanover and many others, where on that block, one side was white and one side was Black. They had their own movie theaters. The only difference was on the Black side of the street, they had a white pharmacist because Blacks weren't allowed to go to school to study pharmacy. But everything was the same on each side. Black church, white church. Black movie theater, white movie theater. That's the historical trauma that I speak of. I have 4 minutes and 53 seconds to tell you a beautiful story. And I'm not going to waste your time. The story gets really juicy. This right here is my family tree back to about 1830. We've been able to figure out till about 1690, and we start going back to England. My son is 23% white. My mother looks like Ann Campbell. My mother is, really light, green eyes. The beauty of all of this is 8 feet wide, 3 feet tall. It hangs on my father's wall. It took me 2.5 years with my son to do the research. But I'm going to tell you a quick story about this one family that is my great-great-grandfather's family. Estelle Perry and Henry Allen Henderson decided to have children. As you can see, they had many. They had about 22. About out of 22, 20 lived. And out of these children, my grandfather, Marlowe Henderson, grew up on a farm. When you meet my grandfather marrying Estelle Perry, you discover about 1910, he's living with his father-in-law. Now they're living on a farm, but by the 1920 census, he's starting to move out and do laboring. As he's a laborer, he now has already about 5 or 6 children. It's time for daddy to move. So you see him in the 1930 census owning his own land. By 1940 census, he now has almost 12 children, 13 children. By 1940, he's had all his children. My grandmother, they thought she passed, but she actually left. He owned a farm that was worth $500. They say it was very mean. He pulled the kids out of school in 3rd grade, the boys specifically, and made them work the farm because that was the only way to eat and provide. So the trauma begins that my grandfather, Marlowe Henderson, lied about his age and ran to Baltimore so that he could get away from this crazy father that he thought was just mean. Everybody ran. I have family in New York. I have baseball players in my family, professional players. Just everybody ran from this farm because the man only knew strength to survive. We would just say he was a survivor. Well, Marlowe Henderson lied about his age, came to Baltimore, started driving trucks. He met Ruth Keyser. They had these children. This is my dad, Marlowe Henderson. When my grandfather, Marlowe Henderson, moved to Baltimore, on the records in South Carolina, North Carolina, his name is Allen Marlowe Henderson. When he moved to Baltimore, he changed his name to Marlowe Allen Henderson. I joke with my brother, my dad, and my nephew that they really are not junior, the 3rd, and the 4th. They really are senior, junior, and the 3rd, because my grandfather's name was not Marlowe Allen. It was Allen Marlowe. But to hide, he changed his name and used it backwards. Very quickly, he lost his job in DC. He was driving in a truck. Somebody lied and said that my grandfather stole money. It later came out that the guy who lied and said that my grandfather stole money, they also blackballed him from the union. My grandfather sued. My father tells a story of them being dressed up, and my grandmother with the eighth grade education wrote a brief to the Supreme Court. They went to court and they offered my grandfather $500,000. Who fired him to give the job to his his nephew, who was a white male. He wanted my grandfather out of the position. So if you lie about a Black person, no one's going to say anything. My grandfather said no, this is $1 million case, and he died poor. The point of the story is the trauma of his life traveled with him everywhere he went. So when we talk about the Oregon communities, we talk about California, and we talk about Seattle, everyone says, oh, the South, the North. Well, who do you think lives in the West? People that used to live in the South and the North. They just moved with them, and their trauma and the stories of racism also moved. The moral to the story is principles from our pain can force us to make deleterious decisions because, as Colette said, we're not thinking, we're just surviving. My father grew up in abject poverty, and he learned to save, provide, and be a better homeowner and provider for his children because my grandfather refused to take any settlement and died poor. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. And here's your story. What's your story, and how have you overcome trauma? Thank you.
Incredible, Corey. Thank you for the higher level and bringing that family perspective. And everyone, we've taken you through a journey. But hopefully the story Corey shared and who Corey is brings a lot of hope to the stories and the journeys we've taken to you. Over to you, Anne, to lead our Q&A.
Thank you all. I want to thank all of our speakers tonight. I am just so honored to be in this space with you. I do have a question from someone. They messaged me. What guidance can you all offer to shape an independent truth-telling process and protect it from political interference?
I want to jump in, Auntie, and just say, I think that any protection that comes has to go back to community-based participatory research. And you can look it up. It's called Cbpr, community-based participatory research. And what Cbpr really requires is that when you come into an organization or a community, the whole goal is to bring your resources, but not to bring your ideas to tell people what they need to do. Every institution, every community has its own culture. Culture, by definition, are shared attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs. If your attitudes, values, and behaviors and beliefs are being directed by someone outside of your community, no longer are you in charge. So to truly be in charge of whatever ideas you have, it has to involve the people running it, but receiving consultation and support by others outside of the community. And in political situations, what happens is you have people that are vying for money, and they're losing the opportunity to have a voice because of a dollar. And then policy moves people. And once you get politicals involved, their job is policy, and they can quickly shift things. So own it, control it, and allow for the community to participate together and base it on the community's needs, not on the needs of a person in office for a short period of time.
Thanks, Corey. And if I just say a few additional words, I'll speak to the process we had with the Sami indigenous people and the concern a lot of the Sami had that how can they trust the state to enter a process and for the state to have a good intent. Like there was a suspicion that because it was launched by state, because I was as a prime minister's envoy or an independent experts trying to advise what is the hidden agenda. And what we came to understand in the conversations is that there is always the reasons for mistrust. It's a leap of faith that needs to happen. There's never guarantees in the beginning. You can be wise in the design, as Corey said, putting the investment and ownership into it. But there has to be a leap of faith from the survivors to share their stories. And there has to be courage by those in power to listen to these stories and have those stories transform the way you see the situation. But what I want to highlight is that never, ever where truth-telling and healing is needed, the situation is perfect. And if you're waiting for a perfect situation, that moment may never come. So it requires certain leap of faith, which doesn't mean that you're blind in terms of how do you design the process. And that's exactly what the survivor centered. How do those voices come forward? and Colette brought a lot of detail to it, but I'll hand it over to Colette and Marcia Perez. We'd love to have your comments as well, because you are one of us.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is in reform efforts, in where I saw some success, because politics is always at play. So I don't think it's really how do you eliminate it, but how do you manage it? And how do you do what you can with as much as you can so that the political aspect is not leading it, as Corey said. And a lot of it comes up with doing a lot of work at the community level with stakeholders and those who know the system and what needs to be done within that system. For example, in Nepal, working with key police officers who knew their system and where the levers were, because it's so hierarchical. So we listened to them and they guided as to what needed to be done within the system, within the political system. And then we supported what they were doing, or what the human rights activists were doing within their communities, because they have their own political dynamics and competition within the different groups. So kind of in short, it was really listening to those who know the system, getting the lay of the land with the political potential landmines, and then trying to navigate that as much as possible, managing, but not being able to fully control it.
Thank you. Marcia, would you like to offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I'll add, just having been involved in many of the conversations, is culture. Organizational culture is really difficult, and people, I think a few of you mentioned, you know, people feel threatened when change occurs because they are in fear of what they do not know. And so, you know, I'm a strong believer in, if you're able to change culture, you're able to change lives. And if we can change police culture, we ultimately can change police lives. I mean, there are plenty of bureaus that have cultures that exist successfully in other communities with less people of color. And so, you know, I think in this community in particular, politics can always tend to get in the way. So I can empathize with the question that's been asked. And part of our work with PSEP is figuring out how to navigate that space and bring community together and elevate the voices of survivors that have been impacted. And how do we do that without re-traumatization? Some individuals have not been addressed for decades. And every time we have to tell our story, everyone's in a different space in their healing journey. And so I feel grateful that I have had the resources and the supports. And when I say resources, I mean a community of individuals who have been able to support me in my trauma so that I could speak about it in a way that allows me to heal. I can't say that for other individuals. And there are a lot of unintentional consequences that come from truth and reconciliation processes, if not done with a lot of care and compassion and some strategy at least, you know. So yeah, that's my thought on that.
Thank you. And thank you all. Our next question, how does truth-telling begin with the Portland police if the country's experiences with police are not also being addressed? In other words, how can we attempt to deconstruct the lack of truth within policing if Portland is only one city in the larger national endemic of violence in policing?
I can only, and I'll be brief. I love these questions. I think the problem is that we look at the police officers like they're inhuman. And one of the things I think we need to do is, as Marcia spoke about, and both Marcias, is that these two groups of individuals, people, and institutions, because people represent families, and families are the smallest form of government, is to bring people together to recognize that everyone wants to go home at the end of the day. And when we can see the humanity in each other, and that's why my model really focuses on policy, because police officers, they go interview for a job based on their ability to pass a psychological exam, but not on their ability to understand the culture of the people that they're policing. That's the only job that I've ever heard of where you don't need to know anything about the community. You need to know nothing about the structure. You don't even need to know the mayor's name. We just need a body. We'll train you to be an animal. And that's scary, because if you interview for a job at Target, you won't get the job if you don't know that Target, their colors are white and red. You won't get the job if you go in there and say Target, unless you're trying to apply for an executive position. The point is that the police officers apply for jobs without any knowledge of the people, and it's scary. So I think the problem is that we need to get back to understanding what people need to build community, and police officers need to recognize what community is. And we do need to deconstruct their training, understand what they're being trained. I don't know if it's actually out there of what training looks like for police officers, but I recognize the importance of humanity, because my daughter is actually finishing the police academy at 22 years old. And as she graduates, I'm seeing they're teaching them how to pull people over, how to protect themselves, but they never learn anything about these people have been traumatized and hurt. How you talk to them is important. You can't call them N-words and bitches and tell them get out the car and don't think they're going to get out with an attitude. You got to teach respect. But how do you do that when you're traumatized every day with the things you see as an officer? Hard question.
Would anyone else like to comment on that?
Colette, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, was the question, how do you approach it in Portland, given Portland is one city when the problem is so much larger? Is that the thrust of the question? Yeah, that's an excellent question. And what I would say to that is, just like what Marcia mentioned about culture, you start where you are. And we can't change anything that's not in our sphere of influence, our sphere of control. You start with the challenges you can, even if it's in your community or one precinct or one area. And so in my mind, Portland is as good a place as any to start, even if it's a part of Portland. And then the goal is then to create the models, to test, to do what you can do and to refine. And then you can the goal there is once something gets rooted, it can then become a model for another location. And then that's how things spread. But if we keep trying to get our whole arms around the whole problem, first of all, it's not possible, because even within a city like Portland, there's microcosms of different challenges. And so even in Oregon, what Portland, my nephew lives in Bend, and Bend is a completely different culture and environment than Portland. So you just start where you are, work where you are, and that's where your sphere of influence can be.
And I would just add that how can this country heal if Portland doesn't start, like turn it around? If there are not places like Portland where you're not starting and changing the realities, how can this country as a nation ever start a national process that heals this country as a nation? But I think it's a wonderful question, and you should talk about it once you get going. How do we maintain the process when things don't become perfect immediately, or something happens in another city? How will it impact us and the trust we're trying to build for the process? And it's really significant to talk it to from the beginning, so you're prepared.
Thank you all. The last question is kind of in thinking of the previous question: how do we keep our community and our focus trauma informed and supporting our community when this work requires a very high skill level that I would imagine would be from outside help? How do we build that trust and keep that focus, as you've said, on our city, on our community?
Again, an excellent question. I want Corey to hear because on the community-based research, you also are building on the community resilience and strengths.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we need to understand how the game is played, and really to get money from institutions, grants, and any type of community building, you need to know how the game is played. So I'll give you a few tidbits. First, no one's going to give you money if they don't know you. So we have to get from behind the wall or the desk or the pen and get out and meet people and see them. And as we see them, whether it's on Zoom or see them in their environment, you can feel and sense their intent. Sometimes on paper, it's hard to really know people, but when you're actually in the environment with them, you can tell what they're really about. That's the first part. The second part is when people come to events, you got to really test them out. And testing them out requires that, what does partnership look like? Federal organizations are no longer just funding, and large organizations are no longer funding one entity grants. You need to have partnerships and relationships that require accountability on more than one level. Because if the accountability is at one level, then who can trust the board? Who can trust where the money's going? Who can trust who's actually scratching out his back? But when it's for the community, it's no longer about the dollars and the cents. Yeah, bills need to get paid, salaries need to be paid, but it becomes, what do you need as a community? So trust begins with the questions that you ask and knowing your purpose, your mission, and your vision, and testing to understand if the people that want to support you actually fit into the mission, the vision, and where your organization's creed is. If you don't have that, it's hard to build an understanding of what you need. And that's a lot of the problem that we suffer. A lot of organizations begin without actually doing the groundwork to understand, where are we going? Why are we doing this? Who do we want to be a part of it? So we can then identify, just like in qualitative and quantitative research, who do we actually want to be our participants in this research? Can't just go out and get everybody. You got to know the personas of those you're willing to work with and those you're willing to actually partner with. And when you do that, it opens the door for you to say, no, thank you. We're not working on the same level here. And I've done it, and it's a very healthy thing.
I would love to add actually a few observations from Marcia, your story. And because you spoke about the deeply traumatizing effort where truth was not spoken, where you were coerced into something that was not true. And just, I'm not sure if you felt at the point being an expert or being a leader in a space, but the way you acted is an incredible example, because you sought for truth. You recognize the meaning of truth and truth to be told. And second, you spoke about the community around you that helps you in your own trauma process. So you had identified the community that is in your support. And third, you mentioned the agency, that you wanted to act upon what you had learned and making sure that this process moves forward. And so you became a PSEP member, and you're contributing in a significant way to a process for the whole city. And I think this is an illustration of a mental process that we often have to go in this. And without, sorry, Marcia, of being so personal, but without you really taking care of yourself, you cannot fulfill that agency. So you have to have that connection to community. You have to understand your sources of resilience and strength, but also your limitations. Sometimes you can be more active. Sometimes you have to withdraw to take care of yourself. So it was a beautiful illustration, demonstration of leadership. And people like you actually are the ones who open these doors and make it possible in a city level, in a community level, family level, in the individual level. So it's not about having specific expertise, but understanding those really beautiful elements that you laid out so well. We'll have to hear Colette if you want to put some further. But Marcia, I hope this captured what you shared with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share. I think, that's it is part of the way that I've been able to heal and show up for community. And, Corey, you mentioned when you were talking, this not wanting to call police, our family members not wanting to do that just for the sake of getting our family members back home. And another theme that often comes up in this work is police and community saying, and police specifically talking about they just want to get home to their families, without recognizing that that's what we want to do too. That's what community wants to do too, that we all have a family at home waiting for us. And I think when these incidents happen, it feels like it just goes out the window, like this person didn't have somebody waiting for them. And, you know, this process of just being, you know, in this space and sharing the story, I couldn't have been here without being able to navigate that balance of being able to take care of myself, to talk really vulnerable. You know, I feel like I'm a particularly resilient person. I've been through a lot of experiences, but I worked in parole and probation. I was greeted by the sheriff every day. And this was an experience that had a visceral impact, the physical. So Colette, when you spoke about the physical pieces of trauma, I have dealt with a lot of grief and loss. And this was a type of loss that I just had not experienced, where I physically could not go into my building because of the peer presence of law enforcement, who I have great relationships. I worked with law enforcement for many years. And like I mentioned, just the demoralizing experience, having been a person in the system that works to, you know, treat people with respect, that worked in a position of power, that had power over people's freedom, and no matter what, I was treating people with respect and being transparent and giving them the dignity that they deserve. And then to be in a courtroom, in a space where a lawyer, a district attorney is saying he appreciates my ability to articulate, he appreciates that I can hold myself together, is really, it became like an almost obsessive in a way that I needed to seek justice. And to your point, Corey, my family actually said, don't call a lawyer because no one's going to believe, like, this just happens. And I could not do that. And so I was really grateful to have been connected with a lawyer who was able to advocate for my family, which resulted in that settlement. But it didn't, you know, there was no follow-up. So it was that beginning stage of change of just the minimal that was done. And it was pretty rubber stamped, but this is how I can, you know, continue to heal. And that's something that I've had to accept, is the minimal.
Well, if I could quickly say, and to Marcia, first of all, that's the power of this work. And Colette and I speak a lot, Auntie and I, and we talk to a lot of different people. But one thing that I understand from qualitative research is the quality of the story. And truly, there are 4 ways that we learn. The first one is storytelling. Hey, you know what? It's a saber-toothed tiger out there. Don't go out there alone. You tell a story. Then there's direct observation. I saw somebody get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. Then the next one is behavioral modeling. When you tiptoe through the woods, I watch you tiptoe, so I tiptoe. And then the 4th one is, wait up, it's high bushes. It must be a saber-toothed tiger out there. So our neighborhood and village condition does matter. And it all started back 200,000-300,000 years ago of how did we survive to get here? How did we get to a Marcia Perez unless somebody survived? And those things that Colette spoke to were the things that we learned in our DNA genetic chromosomal material that says, this is how you survive, Marcia, in your environment. This is how you survive, Tia. This is how you survive, Andre. This is how you survive, Barbara. And each of us survive in our own way, which means that there is no normal. There is no such thing as normal. Normal is how you survive in your skin and how we love each other for who we are, where we are, no matter what our normals look like. Your normal matters to me. My normal should matter to you. Taji, his normal should matter to me. It's not that he's a bad person. I don't know his experiences. And I've been thinking about this thing, and I'll close on this, that we should be talking about trauma from a perspective of trauma to experience, the knowledge of what we learned, to the final point of victory. How do we take the trauma we lived through and feel victorious in the end, like Marcia, that her voice was heard? I'm gonna shut up.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so very much. we had one last question. Are your, when you shared your screen and shared your information, are you going to be sharing that with everyone?
Yes, I can send that out, but you can also go to CJH, Corey Jermaine Henderson, just CJHDRPH.com. CJHDRPH.com. And my models are there, my research is there, and the work that we've done is there. And then Colette can also share the work that she's doing with the research and also the different podcasts.
Yeah, I hope I just put it in the chat, the PowerPoint, and what Corey just mentioned, I'm gonna put in the link. There's a podcast, Think Peace podcast, sponsored by the Mary Hoke Center for Reconciliation, and Corey was one of my guests. So you can listen to him more deeply. And there are other podcasts, one Gail Christopher, who talks about healing, a process for the truth, racial healing process that she's developed. There are a number of different aspects on there. There's one on trauma, so I put that in there. And then the other one is another open source. Okay, I can't type and talk at the same time, I realized. An open source publication sponsored by Mary Hoke Center. It's neuropeace.org, and we just released this month a volume on trauma. One talks about trauma, epigenetic intergenerational trauma from the DNA side. So that's their neuropeace.org. So there are 3 resources.
Thanks. And I'll just say thank you to PSEP for, trusting us to accompany you in this process. And you guys know our emails and phone numbers. So we're really thrilled to help you in this process if you guys find that helpful and moving forward. But back to you and Tachi. Thank you for leading this process.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Dr. Henderson, Auntie, Colette, Marcia, and the other Marcia I know had to jump off. Thank you all so much for your amazing insights and some great ends. That second question was mine and is something I keep pestering Auntie about. And so I wanted to write it in a different way and I wanted to look at it. And so I really enjoyed your answers, and thank you so much for all you shared tonight and provided. As everyone knows, this was recorded, so if you want to share it with anyone, the recording will be hopefully uploaded by tomorrow, and we'll be having one more final workshop next Wednesday at 5 as well. And this will be an opportunity to go into breakout rooms and be discussing in small groups about some of these more practical Portland-based problems, and especially around how your own communities can show up in a truth-telling process. And it'll be really key to what we'll be presenting to City Council in regards to continuing this process. And so it's really essential to get some really great insight and some really great turnout at that last session. So really excited to host that. And once again, thank you all so much for being here tonight and spending your afternoon with us. And I wish everyone a great afternoon and rest of your week. Thank you.